Hello everyone, for this video I used information from published books, the Earth Journal, Greyhawk Mike's Greyhawkery blog, as well as the Canon Fire website. If you like the video, please tell a friend or share it online. Helping others find this lore is very much appreciated. Now, grab a drink, relax, and let's take a journey in Greyhawk. Come in, Commander. Congratulations on your new post as captain of the warship Defiance. As a military governor of Hardby, it falls upon me to inform you thoroughly about one of the most malign lands in the Flanaess, where slavery is rampant and humanity is treated as the lower class. You are young and ambitious, Commander, but do you know your history? Few humans remember the time when the Pomarj was free from the yoke of humanoid domination. Even few of the short races can remember the day when it was under the sovereignty of the Prince of Ulick. But it has been all these things and more. Prior to the Great Migrations a millennium ago, the Pomarj was largely a desolate place inhabited by primitive Flan tribes who worshipped powers of earth and sky. Its poor soil and fell reputation caused it to be avoided by all but the most desperate of these newcomers, and it was eventually settled by small numbers of Zul, who were unwelcome elsewhere and had no choice but to contend with the harsh terrain and its inhabitants. They called these heights the Suenya, until they learned from the Flan their original name, the Dragonsgrabs, literally meaning the tomb of the dragon. In 295 of the common year, an alliance between the Prince of Ulick and King Tavish I of Keelland produced an invasion force that crossed the Jewel River and conquered and subjugated the region within a few short years. The land was carved up into a dozen small baronies and awarded to favoured families of the crown, to be ruled as subfiefs under the protection of the Prince of Ulick. These barons became extremely wealthy from the mineral riches extracted from the mines over the next few decades. In 305 of the common year, Highport was constructed, atop the foundations of a smaller town, in order to exploit this wealth with the rest of the world. More than a century and a half later, the power of the Kioish throne waned after years of conflict. The barons of the Pomarj had no voice in the royal council at Neol Dra. Instead, they were subjects of the Prince of Ulick. The latter withdrew from the kingdom to gain palatinate status from Keelland in 461 of the common year. And the barons of the Pomarj themselves broke with the Prince of Havenhill 2 years later to declare their own independence. They took the city of Highport as their capital and ejected the dwarven garrisons to begin ruling their petty states largely independently, even from each other. A few decades later, conflicts broke out in the Lord Mills between the elves, the dwarves, and men of the region against the orcs and the goblins. This was the beginning of the hateful wars, and the Prince of Ulick appealed to the former baronies of the Pomarj to join the alliance. The Pomarj lords met in Highport the following year to discuss their response, but they saw little reason to involve themselves in what they considered an internal conflict between essentially non-humans. Further, they feared being reabsorbed into the Principality of Ulick, distrusting the motives of the prince, and so turned their backs on the alliance. With the defeat of the Orc and Goblinoid armies in the Lord Mills at the end of the war in 510, the inevitable came to pass. With nowhere else left to retreat, the angry and beaten survivors fell back in the only direction not fortified against them, through the dangerous Sus Forest. 3 years later, these ravaged and vengeful armies emerged from the Sus and descended upon Highport in a frenzy of destruction. Within mere months, the orcs had driven out the local lords and taken over most of the former baronies of the Pomarj, and carved up the realm into small territories ruled over by individual tribes. Shrewd human bandits and privateers still frequented the major cities and towns, however. Anarchy persisted for decades until the mid-560s, when a group arose to seize control of large swaths of the Pomarj and put it under central authority. Calling themselves the slave lords, these humans brokered deals with the orc chieftains and began fostering an illicit trade in flesh. It is accepted as fact that in 579 the dominion of these lords has crumbled, but this could as well be an elaborate ruse. In the early 580s, a new leader emerged to unite the tribes, a rabble-rousing half-orc named Turrosh. During the Greyhawk Wars, he inspired the orc tribes of the Pomarj to reclaim their birthright in the Lord Mills. He shouted to all,
"We forge an empire where none has stood."
This precipitated a successful invasion of the Wild Coast and the Principality of Ulick. Nearly half of those two realms were annexed by Turrosh. States as far away as Furiondi and Ernst are concerned over the rising strength of this new leader, who took the last 5 years to consolidate his holdings. Mind you, Commander, war between the Pomarj and the dwarves of Ulick has continued unabated to the present. The Defiance, Commander, will be protecting ships in the Woolly Bay from this anarchistic stain on the continent. You will need to know the lay of the land, and so does your crew. The eastern part of the Pomarj includes the entire peninsula from the eastern foothills onward. The coastline here is mostly flat, and the shore alternates between long expanses of beaches and cliffsides riddled with caves. It is rumored that dangerous sea creatures make their home near that coastline and are perhaps, except for the Sahwajin or sea devils, allies to the Orcish Empire. Long tales are told that sailors who die on these coasts are turned into undead, making the coastline even more horrific than it already was. The roads that connect the occupied villages, the humanoid camps, and the city of Blue are hard-packed dirt at best, because any significant traffic, especially cargo, is usually taken by sea to Highport or Stoneheim before being transported overland. The Strait of Gernet between the Pomarj and Onwol peninsulas remains open to shipping despite pirates from the Orcish Empire and hostile Scarlet Brotherhood ships from Scand. They enforce the collection of a much-hated toll for safe passage. Patrolling that region will be one of your tasks, Commander. Numerous warships from Greyhawk, Safeton, Nyrand, Irongate and Alyssa will assist in that task. The peninsula's second largest settlement is an anchorage on the eastern tip of the Pomarj. Blue has been an open port and home to pirates and smugglers for centuries, and Turrosh pays them well to harry the shipping lines in the Strait of the Gernet, which makes them a bane to the city fathers of Irongate and Gryrax. Unlike Highport, which fought valiantly to protect itself against the humanoid hordes, almost everyone in Blue with any military or combat skill fled to the seas when the orcs attacked, leaving the weak, the old and the defenseless to hold back an army. The city surrendered almost immediately, and the surprised attackers found themselves in charge of a large population of humans, which they promptly enslaved, putting any who resisted to the sword. The humanoids fought over the spoils of the city and ate its stockpiles of food, while the humans got used to their new status. When food supplies began running low, the orcs turned to the human population for their next meal. Fortunately, some of the smartest slaves were able to convince the oppressors that many of the slaves were fishermen by trade and could do more than just menial labor for their masters. In addition to fishing, the orcs hunted the farm animals that had gone wild since the invasion and began trading with some of the more amiable tribes. As the years passed, the human children raised in this environment gained an appreciation for strength giving the right to rule and violence as an accepted means to solve conflicts. In short, they may have been human by birth, but they were being raised as orcs. Many turned traitor to their own kind and embraced their orcish neighbors, earning superior jobs, as most collaborators with oppressors do. Some of these humans even earned their freedom due to exceptional service or in honor battles with champions of orc tribes. Meanwhile, a generation of half-orcs was being born, some of them slaves, some of them free, further mixing the population of the city. 2 generations after the fall of the city, it is inhabited by a mixture of races and social classes with blurred boundaries. Entirely evil, but functional and united against any opposition. This state continued until the rise of Turrosh, the half-orc champion won over the leaders of the city with praise, gifts and promises of glory in the new era of the Orcish Empire. Within a few weeks, the entire city had begun a transformation from a home of fishermen and pirates to a fortified base of operations for piracy, trade, slaving, and naval warfare. Large earthworks were built around the city walls and squat defensive mounds built upon them. In addition to the threats from other nations, the city suffers regular attacks from the sea devils, the Sahuagin, occurring at least once a season in great numbers, and this for the past 2 years. This attention has warranted the building of a defensive wall along the docks, 20 feet high and steeply canted. It has numerous holes that allow boiling or burning oil to be poured from its top surface and out the side through numerous smaller openings, creating an inferno of death against any invaders from the sea. The dock wall has large gates made of bronze wood and covered in a thick grease that is difficult to burn, which allows the incendiary attacks to be used without risking a breach in security. The gates are usually left open but can be shut with iron bars. Slaves in blue are normally branded or tattooed, with the rune meaning thrall on the forehead or right hand. Those rare slaves who earn their freedom have the opposition rune branded or tattooed over it. As in Highport, crime here is punished by imprisonment, enslavement, or execution, although recently floggings have become popular, with bets being made on the number of lashes a criminal can take before crying out in pain. However, most of the acts considered crimes in civilized cities go unnoticed here. As such, all free people in town are proficient with some weapon, and most slaves are allowed to carry knives to defend themselves against anyone but their owners. Today, the City of Blue is ruled by a council of 3, an even mix of an orc, a human and a half-orc. They were very rich even before they got their current positions and have only increased their wealth since then. Their main duty is to see that the trade goods are not hindered, rogue pirates are dealt with, and crime is kept to a minimum. The northern Pomarj includes the plains to the north of the Dragongrab's hills and the Sus forest. The forest runs into western Pomarj and up north towards the Lord Mills. Although the western end of the forest, near the Lord Mill Mountains, is open and clean, east of the Jewel River it is a foreboding place. A dark and dreary wood filled with thorn trees, brambles, briars and thickets. Its massive trees are black with age, seeming to menace those who pass under their boughs. The center of civilization in the northern Pomarj is the city of Highport. Many of the other villages scattered about the landscape have been razed by humanoids and are now only occasionally used by nomadic tribes as places to camp. The land is fairly fertile and has a large population of deer due to human farmlands having been wiped out and nature reclaiming the land. The northern Pomarj has many small coves and beaches that are favored as stopping points for the more independent pirates of Woolly Bay. These pirates, however, make sure to identify themselves and pay a toll to local humanoid tribes. The road leading from Highport into Drachensgrabs, known as the Slave Road, is paved with bricks built with slave labor and ending in Stoneheim on the southern end. Highport was once a minor jewel of the barons of the Pomarj, the center of a bustling shipping and trade industry. Here, from lands all around the Sea of Gurnet, ships carried their goods and the market squares were filled with foreign merchants. But that was before the dark wave of destruction swelled out of the hills. Highport was too rich a target to be ignored by the murderous bands of humanoids, and although it resisted the assaults on several occasions, the loss of life became too great. The gates were sundered and the walls breached. Highport burned. So why is the city not only still standing, but the former capital of the region is still the largest city in the Pomarj? Well, after the destruction, the wisest of the humanoid chiefs had spoken in the council.
There is no victory without spoils of war. Our deeds will turn to dust, and none shall fear our presence.
Thus, the occupied Highport became a place to trade with menfolk. Although portions of the city are still in ruins, a legacy of their great conquest, the markets and shipyards that once made it an important commercial center have all been restored. Strangely enough, humanity still seems to outnumber other groups in Highport. That is not because of the persistence of the original settlers, for they have been slaughtered to a man. No, it is because thousands of evil men with evil reputations have flocked to the port city and freely mingle with half-humans and humanoids. Highport is now ruled by a coalition of tribes, split by mercantile and mercenary factions, and blood feuds are rampant. This council of tribes reports indirectly to the despot Turrosh. The city may have a council, the laws are simple, and justice is nowhere to be seen. A strong sword arm is quickly turned into a judge, jury, and executioner, a dark alley, an execution ground. It is correctly rumored that press gangs roam the broad streets at night, seeking those foolish enough to wander around unprotected. One may wonder what else lurks the streets during the long hours of night. Still, the lure of trade and profit draws men here, but it is a much different trade from what it once was. It is an evil trade, dealing heavily in misery and hardship. Many slaves pass through this port to stand on the blocks in its markets, and many come to buy. The central part of the Pomarj Peninsula is dominated by the Drachensgrabs Hills, formerly called the Svenja Hills by the Sul. These hills are infamous for being both rich in mineral wealth and teeming with monsters that stalk its slopes and terrorize the humans dwelling along the coasts. Built long ago by slow volcanic action, they are covered in rich topsoil and supports a thriving ecology of plant and meat eaters. Occasional earthquakes beset the place, although few are large enough to cause any major damage. However, legends warn that powerful beings will awaken in anger if their resting places beneath these mountains are disturbed. Because it is surrounded on all sides by bays, the hilly center of the Pomarj has frequent rains, strong on the fringes, but gentle towards the interior. As a result, the place is covered in small streams and small lakes. Some you can swim in, while others are little more than standing water over a layer of thick mud. The irregular configuration of the hills means that most of these lakes are permanent and have their own population of fish, aquatic plants, a prehistoric reptile or two, and so forth. At the center of the Drachensgrabs are three large mountains that jut violently upward, towering over the nearby hills. The largest is Drachenskopf. To the west is Mount Flammenblut. In the south rises the smoking mountain called Drachaluz. A fourth smaller mountain, known as Hakentos, stands in the shadow of Drachenskopf. As stated before, the Drachensgrabs are bisected by a brick slave road leading from Highport to Stoneheim, and it is patrolled regularly. Hidden within the Drachengrabs mountains is a dormant volcano. The valley within that crater has a magnificent blue lake in its center, and in the middle of that lake rises the ancient volcanic peak, Mount Flammenblut. It is rumored that at its base is a town, perhaps even a city. Words are whispered. The name Stoneheim can be heard in the darkest corner in the Pomarj, the city of the slave lords, some would claim. The entrance to this valley is virtually impossible to find. Steep the path will be, and its hidden guards will tolerate no trespassers. I dare not talk more of this place, lest spies are listening, but the latest I heard was that a volcanic eruption in the mountains destroyed their hidden stronghold in 579. The Drachensgrabs have always been a peculiar land, an anomaly among the more settled regions of the Flannes. Rumors aside, there is at least one sleeping and dangerous power in these superficially pleasant lands, and that is the Twisted Forest. This forest is no forest at all, but rather a collection of stony pillars. These grey shapes have as much the aspect of humanoid shapes as of trees. They are scattered over the hillside meadows, but it would be difficult to mistake them for vegetation. They range in size from that of a very small goblin to that of a very large ogre, but their twisted upper extensions are as suggestive of upraised arms as of branches. It is notable that despite their great age, they do not bear the abundant mosses, lichens and birds' nests that the local outcroppings of native rock display in such abundance. One has the feeling of being watched when in the presence of these trees, and the patterns on the trunks that suggest tormented faces does not help shake the feeling that to touch these stones, one might actually go mad. The Twisted Forest would be entirely mysterious were it not for records of the Kioish court at Nialdra. An ancient and much recopied manuscript there purports to be a history of the Sul peoples immediately after the last disaster of the Sulite Empire, penned down by one Uhas of Nehili. In this history is the tale of a particularly wicked band of Suluis who fled with all their treasures eastward along the northern coast of the Azure Sea. They were as learned and powerful as they were cruel, and met with success in all their evil ventures, until at last they slaughtered a band of innocent Flan tribesmen in a particularly vile manner in the Sonia Hills. By doing so, they brought on themselves a most terrible curse from certain Flanish gods the tribe had worshipped, that neither they nor any of their kind should leave the valley in which the massacre occurred, and they should be monuments to their own wicked behavior, pillars of tortured stone for all the world to see. This would seem to be a clear reference to the Twisted Forest, and it is commonly accepted among historians that the Sonia Hills were the Drachensgrab, as known to early Sul colonists. Accepted, but is it true? The southern region comprises all the land due south of the Drachengrab's mountains. As one travels south and west along the coast from blue, the softer rock of that region turns hard and the landscape more rugged. The foothills of the Drachengrabs become visible from the rocky beaches of the south shore, and palisade forts and small walled towns replace the numerous caves. The trails and roads among the forts and towns are kept clear, and all the major ones are well patrolled, and many of hard-packed earth. The road north from Stoneheim, amply named Brick Road, is frequently patrolled by mercenaries and troops from Stoneheim and connects to many lesser mining roads. The road to the south, the Sea Road, splits after a few miles into several smaller roads that lead to various fishing villages and small ports on the coast of the Azure Sea. An older road goes west to link several forts and towns in that part of the Pomarj, eventually connecting to Havenhill in the Principality of Ulick, although the last 100 miles or so has become less defined since the conquest of the land west of the Jewel River. Despite the sturdiness of the underlying ground, the topsoil is actually enriched by volcanic ash. Short grass and scrub plants cover almost everything, making the southern Pomarj a haven for herbivores of all types and the creatures that prey upon them. Some of the streams that run from the hills are rich enough that a prospector could make a living panning for gold, and many pit mines in the lowlands are profitable, as well as the many mines in the hillsides. Occasional serpentine creatures are seen offshore, but the southern coast faces fewer monstrous threats from the sea than the eastern one. It are the navies of Kioland and the Principality of Ulik that pose a greater threat to the Pomarj. The current capital of the Pomarj is the city of Stoneheim, a thick-walled citadel that sits in the shadows of the southern face of the peaks of the Drachensgrab mountains. This squat, affluent place was once the center of the mining operations inaugurated by the Kiosh throne 3 centuries ago and was built largely by dwarven hands from Ulik. Following the Hateful Wars, the humanoids found Stoneheim to be a rich target, full of gold from its mines and led by people grown fat and lazy on their wealth, relying on mercenary bands to guard them. Upon seeing the armies of orcs pouring over the horizon, most of the mercenaries wisely fled. The orcs crashed into the city, killing those who stayed and causing the rest to scatter into the hills. Amazed at the amount of gold in the city, but under pressure from other tribes behind them, the orcs picked up whatever loot they could, spent the night in the city and left the next day to pillage the nearby towns and villages. Several of the more powerful, unscrupulous mercenary bands returned to Stoneheim and seized power, proclaiming themselves the new lords of the city. They closed the city to outsiders and trained all able-bodied people in the use of simple weapons such as the crossbow, spear and sling, and set them to guard the walls whenever a threat approached. When another small army of orcs came near, the new lords called over the wall to the orc leaders, proposing an arrangement. The city would give them some gold and the orcs would leave. The leader of this tribe, a cunning half-orc named Narth, agreed to the offer and took the money and left. Narth returned later with a haggard army with a new proposition.
You humans are isolated and surrounded by humanoid tribes. We need a base of operations.
Within 3 days, they had agreed to a peace treaty, paying the orcs a small yearly wage and allowing them to live outside Stoneheim's walls, in exchange for diverting other tribes away from the city. Over time, the arrangement became less formal, and people began to cross into each other's turf to barter and socialize. The town has now become fairly well mixed between humans, orcs and half-breeds. It is for this reason that Turrosh chose this place as the capital of his new empire, for he saw this as the best place for him to coordinate his orc armies and his human mercenaries. The mercenary lords first resisted the half-orc, but in mere hours all swore allegiance to his most ferocious majesty, the despot Turrosh. Now, Stoneheim has only 2 primary purposes: the training and deployment of troops to the provinces of the empire and as headquarters for the continued exploitation of the mineral resources of the hills. Turrosh usually spends no more than a few days a month in Stoneheim, taking up residence with whatever city lord he feels needs to be brought in line at that time. And finally, the western Pomarj. It was originally just a piece of land defined by the edges of the Sus Forest, the Jewel River, the Dragonsgrab's Hills, and the southern coastline. The Jewel rises into the Lordmill Mountains south of the Cron Hills and flows through the nations of Selene, the county of Ulik, and the Pomarj to empty in the Azure Sea. Gold and gemstones are still found below its swift-moving waters. It once formed the western border of the Principality of Ulik. Most people consider the western Pomarj to be all the lands south of the Sus, from the western part of the Drachensgrabs to the eastern edge of the Lord Mills. But since 584, it includes both banks of the river. when the forces of Turrosh captured it. The former Ulic land was once plentiful farmland, but has become wild and overgrown since it was taken over by the humanoids. The dwarven prince Olinstad of the principality has built a chain of citadels extending northward from the city of Havenhill in an effort to prevent any more losses to the Orcish Empire. And the attitude of his people is one of hatred towards the humanoids and a desire to take revenge. Like the other flat parts of the Pomarj, the place is dotted with remnants of villages with occasional settlements of humanoids. The former croplands of Ulic has become a place of grazing for small and large herbivores alike, as well as a population of feral cats. Local humanoids don't care what sort of animals they catch, and some of the weaker tribes get by on mouse stew and other strange fare. The principal inhabitants of the Pomarj today are the humanoid tribes, those that came down from the Lord Mills, conquered the region and are all under the thumb of the Emperor of the Pomarj. The most rebellious tribes were expended against the human and demi-human forces to the north and west, while the ones that were more accepting to the despot's rule were rewarded with loot, land and slaves. The majority of these humanoids are either orcs or goblins, but there are many hobgoblin, gnoll and kobold groups as well. All these tribes can be divided into 28 large tribes with a permanent base. More often than not, these bases are former dwarven mines or strongholds, sometimes expanded by their new inhabitants. As it stands now, despite their differences, the various races and tribes of the Pomarj enjoy their current status and the security gained by their informal alliance, and it is likely that any tribe that rebels against the group will quickly be devoured by its neighbors, and not necessarily in a figurative manner. Well, if you made it this far and enjoyed my video, please leave a comment. Show your support by ringing that bell icon. I want to thank everyone that is already supporting me by sharing my content on other platforms, liking the videos, spreading the lore. I especially want to thank the patrons that sponsor my work and help me keep my gear and software running. If you want to interact more with me, head over to my website where you can also join the league. I've put all the links in the description. On a final note, I do not know all the artists whose work I used in this video, and if you are the artist or know who it is, please let me know so I can give the proper credits. Take care.